Great. So let's begin. Today we are going to cover what the Buddha taught as the central teaching. His main teaching was, of course, the presentation of it was the Four Noble Truths. But in terms of understanding how human experience works, in terms of the understanding, what we're going to discuss today is absolutely central. It's often treated as a very complicated subject, and it's not always covered in a lot of places. But we've in the twin practice, we think that it is very, and we also very closely connected with the practice itself. Okay, so that's what we'll be talking about today. Quickly, let me just recap the ground that we've been covering. A lot of you have made excellent progress in your practice, and I'm sure you'll be starting to get glimpses of the things we've discussed so far in your practice itself. Right? We started with just a very simple premise, understanding why attention is important and why we should pay attention to it. We covered the three mental skills: the skill of harmonious practice, the 6 R's, being able to bring your mind gently back from anything that it is engaged with, a distraction, a rabbit hole that is not what you intended to do. It has gone in and made its home there. How do you get it back gently? Right? The second skill that we covered is mindfulness, the ability to actually detect that, the remembering to observe how mind's attention moves, sharpening that. I'm sure all of you are already seeing that happen in your practice, your mindfulness getting sharper. I'm optimistic that many of you are also seeing it in daily life as you practice your mindfulness, being able to see where your attention is, being able to see when there is craving, that tension and tightness in your mind. And the third skill that we talked about was collectedness. And we also talked about the collected states, the different jhanas. We covered it. I am covering it also in more detail with some of you in your interviews, depending on where you are in the practice. And we also talked about why the Brahma Viharas are useful, why they're important, what the Brahma Viharas are, and how they combine with the practice. Finally, yesterday we talked about two things that were going to be part of the discussion today, which is the sense spaces, the Buddha's use of sense spaces, especially mind as a sense space as well, and the 5 aggregates, the things, the ingredients that come together to make human experience: form, feeling, conditioning, consciousness, and concepts or perception. Right? So today, all of it is going to come together to understand how an individual experience of life happens. Okay, so we'll be covering the topic known as dependent origination. Before that, I'll just talk about something that is related to the aggregate of sangya or concepts, right? So something related to that, and it is important to the rest of the discussion as well. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so this is a quote, a very, very awesome quote. I think captures a lot very pithily. All models are wrong, but some are useful. It's attributed to the British statistician George Box, but it's been debated whether he was the person. Not important. So let's just take a pause here. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So we use different models to represent things, right? So when we study algebra in school, or we even study Newtonian physics, right? So we always solve for things in a vacuum without friction, things like that. We make assumptions. We model things, we reduce reality into something that we can work with, or we talk about the population, right? You have a census and you have demographics. You create clusters of people. Same thing you do for e-commerce companies, for instance, create personas. And while a lot of behavior can be predicted, there is some predictability to models. They can be useful in the right context, but all of them are essentially a incorrect representation of reality. You're missing a lot of detail, you're missing a lot of context, you're making a lot of assumptions, right? So I want to start with this topic before moving on to the rest of the discussion on dependent origination. So the first thing, right? So our assumption is normally that we experience reality. We see reality and we take actions that are appropriate. Right? And I'm going to challenge this a little bit. Okay. First, something simple, optical illusion. A lot of you may have seen, you have two squares that are called A and called B. So you can raise your hands if you think they are the same color, or if you think A and B are the same color, please raise your hand. Okay. So I've just put a box on top, right? Which is like one color. There is no gradient, nothing. And you can actually see that it is A and B are actually the same color. If I go back, your mind is modeling that there is a cylindrical object that is casting a shadow on a chessboard. These are things that you're familiar with. Your mind is making an assumption. In most cases, the assumption that your mind makes is quite useful. But in this case, if you're thinking about the shades of it, if you're thinking about whether the cylinder is on top of the checkered board, probably the model is useful. If you think there is a light gradient on the cylinder, it's probably useful. But when you are asked a specific question, it may turn out to be wrong. So another thing I want to talk about, this is called the hungry judge effect. Okay, so there was a study around 10 years back, dozen years back, about over 1,000 decisions made by Israeli parole boards, right? And an interesting thing was seen. So we assume normally judges are people who are trained to be objective, to take emotion out of the things, to work diligently to interpret the law. And it was found that the average paroles that were granted at the beginning of a session was 65%. And right before the lunch break, when people are getting hungry, when the judges are getting hungry, it is very close to 0%. So there have been people who have challenged the mix of who comes to the parole board early, who gets shown up later and earlier, etc. But no matter what adjustments you do, the same trend holds. So somebody who's supposed to be literally paid for their objectivity, who may be expecting that they experience reality, interpret reality, and act on it, are actually working on models that are very fickle. And the difference is stark, right? It is not a small difference. It goes from 65% parole grants to almost 0% as you get closer and closer to lunchtime. Third example, you might see a person of this shape next to you. So if you're, again, the context is important, right? If you are to make a guess whether they can squeeze onto the bench next to you, you'll probably make a good guess. If you make a guess that you may be lighter than them or heavier than them, you'll probably make a reasonably good guess. But if you were to, say, read further into it and make assumptions about whether this is a lazy person, whether they're good at what they do or not, there is a possibility you may get wrong. You may be wrong. So I've been using these examples to illustrate one point. The mind is a prediction engine. It works with a very small part of the data that is available in reality, very small part of the information, and I'll talk about that also a bit, and further compresses them into mental models, right? So a judge, they have a few minutes to make a sense of what happened here and whether or not a person is suitable for parole, and they have to take a decision. So they're working with a very small part of reality. Then they're further compressing it into mental models, which are getting colored by the fact that they are hungry or not, and they are taking a decision based on that. So just to illustrate, in when we think about our vision, we normally think that we have the world in front of us, and all of it appears like in a photograph, right? All of it is coming into our mind. Why do these optical illusions work, right? The first example. Optical illusions work because when we look at any point of time, right? If you were to extend your hand and look at the size of your thumbnail, so that area is the area in focus. It takes around 96% of your visual cortex, right? So the brain's part that processes vision images. So 96% of it is focused on that thumbnail, and the rest of it is just filling in gaps. And you have blind spots. So that's what's happening. We are actually predicting, we are making a prediction of what the world is like because we have some idea of things. If I was to look at this, I need very few data points to figure out that this is a bottle, right? Or if I look at this, I need very few data points to figure out this is probably a remote, and so on for a laptop, right? So we take a very small portion of reality, then we compress it further into mental models. And all this models, this library of models is Sangya, right? We compress it into that and then act as if we are actually dealing with reality. So how does this actually affect us? So in our life, we always think that we are experiencing reality, we are responding to reality, so we must be right about what we're doing, about the actions that we're doing, about the thoughts that we are thinking, about the way we are interpreting situations. But what's actually happening is we are telling ourselves a story that is based on very little data and that is compressed into concepts that you already know, are familiar with, and know how to work with. Okay. So with that as the basis, I will start going into dependent origination. Okay. So this statement says a lot, and I'm in complete agreement. Now, this has been said by the Blessed One. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. So it's a necessary and sufficient condition for understanding how human experience works. This was said by Sariputta. It's one of the two foremost students of the Buddha. There's an excerpt from Madhyama Nikaya, the Middle Length Discourses, number 28. Okay, so what is dependent origination? So we might remember from the Noble Truths, the Buddha had a very simple way of putting things together, right? So he said there is suffering, existence of suffering. He said there is an origin, there is something that it is dependent on, dukkha samudaya, which is craving. And he said, when he talked about dukkha nirodha, the cessation of suffering, said with the cessation of craving comes the cessation of suffering. So you have A is dependent on B. If we remove B, then A ceases to be because it is dependent on B. So this is a technique that he uses for understanding a lot of things, and this is also fundamentally how things work in our mind as well. So dependent origination, right? Dependent origination, the fundamental concept of also understanding this is that every phenomena that are being talked about are independence on each other, right? So we've discussed this in the last few days when we talk about some distraction coming up. Distractions come up because the conditions are right. So dependent on conditions, they arise, and when the conditions change, they go away. For example, if a distraction comes up, the condition for that may be your craving. When you use the 6 hours and you diffuse the craving, that may disappear. It may not happen in one time, may come up again and again. If you use the 6 hours multiple times, it may go away. And I'm sure by now all of you have experienced this, right? So this is a simple example of dependence, right? And now the Buddha traces the entire working of the human mind based on this. Okay, so we'll begin. So there are three segments of dependent origination. How we are currently configured, right? That is one part. So what is it? What is the system? That is the state of the system right now. What is the interaction with the environment? What information is coming in? What is happening there? And then finally, what is the behavior of the system? So there are three sections to it. The fundamental basis of suffering, of our compulsive behaviors and creating dissatisfaction in life that all of us have experienced, right? So the Buddha says ignorance or avidya is the fundamental basis. I will talk more on certain parts of it, especially the environment interaction and the compulsive behavior. These are topics we'll continue to unpack in the coming days, but I want to at least introduce them. So what is avidya or ignorance? It is not understanding how the mind works. It is, for instance, it is making the mistake of assuming models are reality, not understanding we are working with models when we are working with model when we are actually thinking that we're working with reality. Not understanding how the mind works, not understanding how the different mechanisms work, not understanding where how craving works, not understanding the truth, the origin, and the cessation of suffering. There are more parts of it. Again, we'll discuss that. So with that as the basis, now again, all of these are dependent. I have specifically put this in a vertical order. You can think of it as a building, multi-story building, right? Every story is dependent on the existence of the stories below. If one of the floors, one of the stories was removed, then the rest of the edifice will not be sustained. Okay, so that dependence, the same thing that we saw between suffering and craving, that logic will be carried over here as well. So dependent on ignorance, we have sanskara, personalized conditioning. The impressions that we have from our actions. So when we take an action, if we speak in anger in a situation, we condition ourselves that this is the appropriate way to do this. As children, we see our people behave a certain way with their friends, with family, with people who work for them, and we tend to learn what it is. And we all think we all assume that this is the way, this is how things happen. In life, we often face as we grow up, we find a lot of these assumptions challenged. But we do have this conditioning, and even when they are challenged, you may hold on to another assumption. You may make some impression of a situation, you may learn something, and that becomes part of your conditioning. So all the impressions from the actions you have taken. So actions are very important. Actions can be mental actions, thinking in a certain way. Actions can be verbal actions, saying something, and actions can be physical actions, right? Doing something. So you have impressions from the actions that you take, and you have impressions from the actions around you that other people take, the events around you that happen. Right? So you carry these impressions, and this is personalized conditioning. So this is conditioning that doesn't really understand how the mind works. It is conditioning thinking of what the mind experiences as being actually reality, thinking of models as reality. Based on conditions, we have a certain flavor to our discerning or discriminating intelligence, right? So being able to look at different pieces of information, figure out the difference between them, figure out any similarities between them, sort them, make sense of them, information processing, right? So we discussed there are 6 types of information processing abilities that we have as humans, and they have certain limits, right? So we can see certain wavelengths of light, we can hear certain frequencies of sound. Other animals may have different, consciousnesses. There may be like bats don't respond to light, but they do create a mental map of their surrounding, but they have different consciousness, right? So we have a set of information processing abilities, Vigyan or Vijnana, that are related to the six sense bases: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness, Manorvigyan. And we have a link between the mental realm and the physical realm. So, based on the fact that we have these capabilities, dependent on that arises mentality, materiality, the ability to interact with the physical world. Okay. So, this part, the foundation, this is a system that is there. You have certain conditioning, you have a certain tendency not understanding how the mind works in absolute clarity. You have a sense of it, maybe you have no sense of it, you have an assumption of it, you have a model of it, you think that is how the world is, right? So you have that, you have some conditioning, you have some information processing ability, and you have linked to the external world, right? So this is like a hardware software link, very crudely speaking. This is the basis, this is the system as it is today. Okay? Now you interact with the environment. What is required for that? So you have the sense basis. So you can actually, this classification sense basis can be thought about as the current system as well. I have made a mistake in coloring, it would seem. So sense basis, once you have the link between the mind and the physical realm, you then have the sense basis, which are the six sense bases that we've done. So you can think of these as sensors. You have sensors on your phone, a sensor that looks at the light, changes the brightness. You have a sensor that is used to capture images, right? So these are sensors for your system to interact with the external world. Then we have the next two links of dependent origination. Now we have a system that is capable of interacting with the world. In this moment, an interaction happens. Okay. This is called Phassa. Okay, and before that, Shalayatan is the six sense bases. Okay, just explaining the Pali there. Phassa is related to the Sanskrit word sparsh or touch, as those who understand Sanskrit will identify. So this is called contact, right? This is an event of information. How does this happen? It comes by the coming together of three things. The coming together of external information that can be processed. So ultraviolet light, maybe your eye can't process, maybe your skin can process, unfortunately. But so something that can be processed by your faculties, external information. In the case of the mind, it can be internal information, it can be a thought. So there is information, there is a sense space, right? So if we talk about light, right, there can be a sense space of the eye. And you have the third ingredient. So we have the sense base, we have the information, and we have the consciousness, right? So we have the ability to make sense of that information, which is Vigyan, Chakshur Vigyan, or eye consciousness in this case. The coming together of these three is contact. So contact won't happen, for instance, if your sense base is not working, your eye is not working, your ear is not working, your eye is closed, right? Or if your consciousness is not working, you don't have the ability to see, your system is not working, or it is right now not active for some reason, you're still maybe waking up, you're not really, it has not really fired up, right? So your consciousness needs to be there and the external information needs to be there. So there is stuff behind my laptop screen that I can't see because the information from there is unable to reach me. So when these three conditions are satisfied, there is contact, there is a information. I can't see the things behind me, for instance, directly behind me. I can see the stuff that is on the video, but yeah, I can't really see them. So there is no contact happening from that. Now, based on contact, okay. So without, so again, look at the dependent origination, right? So without mentality, materiality, and the sense basis, you could not have contact, right? So because there needs to be consciousness, there needs to be a link to the sense basis, and then with that, there needs to be information. So all of these things have to be there. If one of the floors in the middle is not working, is not present, then the rest of the edifice will collapse. So if there's no mentality, materiality, there would be no connection between the sense space and your consciousness, right? So it would not work. If there was no sense space, there would be no contact. Once there is contact, there can be a feeling. Okay, feeling we discussed yesterday will be of three types. Feeling can be pleasant, feeling can be painful, feeling can be neither pleasant nor painful. So feeling is something that it is a pre-conceptual alert. So it is saying something is happening here and it is requesting for attention. So all of your sense spaces are requesting for information. The one that makes the most painful or pleasant feeling, right? So the pleasant or painful feeling is correlated with whether it is a threat, and the intensity of that feeling is related to how big of a threat is it perceived to be, right? So you are getting different signals, right? So assume the mind is like we've taken this analogy, it's like the CEO of a company. Everybody wants the CEO's attention, but you see what is there some really good opportunity, something that we really have a lot to gain from, or is it something threatening to shut our company down, right? So when the Silicon Valley Bank shut down in the US, everybody's attention went there. It's a big threat, painful sensation, right? So Vedana is a preconceptual alert requesting for information. So till now there is a system that is in place, and there's a moment of interaction with the environment, and this is happening at all our senses. Multiple contacts are happening. Now, based on feeling, right? So, based on the feeling that seems to be dominant, our attention will go towards that. This is the segment now. This is the third segment that is starting to make this personal, that is starting to move towards compulsive behavior, that is putting your interpretations into things. Your modeling of reality is going to begin now. Tanha or craving, it's symptomized by the tension and tightness in your mind. Your attention is literally gripping on to some information event that has happened, and that your system says that painful feeling or pleasant feeling. And it is typically, at this stage, there is not too much concept attachment. There's not too much of an understanding of what's happening. But craving simply says attention is going there, and it is the I like it or I don't like it mind. It says either I like it and I want more of it in my life, or I don't like it and I don't want any of it in my life. Right? So when the signal comes, your mind goes into personalizing. Why does this personalizing happen? Right? So personalizing essentially mobilizes your entire system for action. So you can see something objectively, okay, this needs to be done. Where is the motivation to act? Right? So that motivation to act comes from craving. That the system understands that as soon as I start putting I, right? So if you see, again, an example we've used before, a bus speeding towards you, okay? And you see it objectively that this bus will be here in a few seconds, and if it hits the skin and bone, the system, the skin and bone is not going to emerge as the winner in that interaction, right? Probably going to take a long time to heal. So what craving does it immediately personalize. It says, I don't want this, and you jump out of the way. So it's a call to action, but it is also extremely personalized. And this is something, so models can be useful and models can be harmful as well. So craving personalizes this entire situation. What happens after craving? And again, see the dependence, right? So craving is dependent on feeling. So unless there was no feeling that was generated, if there was a neutral feeling, there might not be craving. So a lot of all the things that are happening, your attention is going somewhere, right? The craving is dependent on feeling, it is dependent on contact, it is dependent on the sense basis, it is dependent on mentality, materiality, on consciousness. Okay, next we have clinging or upadan. So tanha is also translated as Krishna in Hindi for those who can get some more context from that. Upadan is called clinging, it is further grasping, and it is essentially now you're starting to model reality, right? So in parallel, it doesn't come in this set of links, but we talked about concepts, right? We talked about concepts as one of the five aggregates, key part of how we understand the world. So clinging starts putting a story to it. Why do I like it? Why don't I like it? What do I think of this? So we take reality, we model it, we add the story of why I like it or why I don't like it. Again, like I said before, so the mind is a prediction engine, right? So what it does, it looks at the environment, it tries to understand what is happening, it tries to make a prediction of what is going to happen next, and based on that, it is going to decide on what action to take. So I'll just repeat that. Understand what's happening, model the world, make a mental model of what's happening in the world, decide on an action, predict what's going to happen next, right? Because you don't want to just see the bus where it is and decide that, hey, this is 10 meters away from me. You want to predict, you want to, from what you've seen, you are able to predict that it's going to crash into you. And then you act, right? So you want to act at the end of it. So in a way, what we're doing is once we've modeled, right? The next thing that happens is bhava. Bhava is coming towards existence. It is the kind of sense of the actual word, Pali. But essentially, what you're doing is you are moving towards a library of habitual patterns. How do I respond to this? So, in maths or any physics, for example, if you've done any of that in school, uh, mostly in maths, right? You always try to understand a problem and you try to reduce it to a type of problem that you have solved before. You break it down, right? And then you know a set of two or three techniques to solve that kind of problem, right? So that's what we're doing in life. We are trying to understand the environment, break it down into something we've seen before, something that we understand, and then we have a set of actions that we can default to, right? So we start kind of choosing between those actions, and there will be a set of actions that is dependent a lot on recency, on what's going on in your mind. So your conditioning is changing at all points of time. So the decision that you make may not always be consistent, right? So the judge makes a different decision in the morning, different decision in close to lunch. You may stub your toe at some point of time, but you're busy with something else. You don't care about it. Another day you might get irritated about it, make a noise about it, right? So you have these different habitual patterns and a lot of things like recency, like what's been going on in your mind. All those things affect the pattern or pattern that you actually choose, and based on that you come with an action. So we'll talk about a couple of examples of how this will happen, just to illustrate the whole cycle of this happening, right? The next step is jati, or birth of a reaction. Why do I call it reaction? Because it is compulsive. It is not considered in the way, in the sense that it is driven by your personal motivations, personal prejudices, personal biases. Compulsive behavior based on our habits, what we have done, based on our concepts, right? Again, pausing at this point to see the dependence, right? So the reason you went towards a reaction was because of your habitual pattern. The reason you went towards certain habitual patterns was because of the way you built a story around that incident. Perhaps at another time you may create a different set of stories, and we'll talk about that. The reason you made that story is driven by craving. So if your attention was not there for a long time, was driven by craving, you might not have made that story, right? So the example of stubbing the toe, you might have momentarily gone into craving for that, but then you have something important. You are getting strong Vedana from that. Your mind is going towards that. You don't go into clinging, you don't go into, if you don't go into clinging, you don't go into habitual patterns of saying. You may just go into a small loop of maybe swearing. I hope you're not doing it right now because of the precepts, and I hope you won't continue to do it. But you may make an exclamation, let's call it, and move on, or you may, get irritated about why something was not in the place that it should have been. It can lead to other story, right? So reaction happens based on habitual patterns, and then there is the aging and death also. There is the consequences that come from the reaction. Multiple consequences. Immediately, the actions that you take are already affecting your condition. Right? So if you remember impressions from actions and experiences, sanskar. Your sanskar is getting edited by the action that you've taken. Your action may set into motion another entire set of dominoes that may have consequences at a future time. So this is dependent origination, and what the Buddha says is dependent. Every step of this is dependent on the previous one. Okay. So I'm going to take a pause. So if there are any questions, any thoughts, I'll take that. Then I'll talk about a couple of examples, and then I'll talk about how this also relates to the Four Noble Truths and to our practice as well. Okay. So I'll just take a pause because this might have been a fair amount to take in. And if there are any questions about this, we can engage in that right now. Yeah, go for it.
It's a very revealing framework. When I look at it, I'm reminded of, all those habits that I've tried to unwound in the past, only to kind of find myself being, rather lapsing into these bad habits once again. Because, as I look at it, the intervention that I would have made would perhaps be at the compulsive behavior level, maybe a substitute, or you're looking to kind of change things in your environment where you're trying to negate certain senses. But I think in order to kind of make a lasting change to what's really at the top, the compulsive behavior, I think the lesson here is that one needs to go down the base of this. Is my understanding correct? I'm just maybe verbalizing how I understood
think you are onto a very good insight, and I will, like I said, we'll talk about how the practice helps you understand this better, right? So, so you actually hit the nail on the head to a large extent. So the section that is on top, right, compulsive behavior. I'm just going to take a second and correct the sense basis thing. It's bothering me because that should be blue. I managed to get that wrong. So I'll just fix that for a sec. And see, you are onto a very, very important insight, right? So what you talked about, the compulsive behavior. So the behavior part is actually what is in our control, right? We do not have a direct access to the part that is below, the current system that we have. So we can't, unfortunately, just edit that. Right? We can't directly just go and say, okay, may my consciousness be like this. May I see green as blue and may I see orange as red. Right? We can't go and edit that just because we want to. Right? The environment, again, the environment interaction, right? So that we are talking about, that is again difficult because you have, you can't, may, again, the same thing, right? May my feeling be this way, may my feeling be that way. If you dislike bitter gourd, for instance, right? Or if you absolutely love chocolate, you're not going to eat chocolate and feel disgusted by it, at least by the flavor of it. You may judge yourself later, but that's a different thing, right? So the action that we have is actually in the compulsive behavior part. And the Buddha says, work at absolutely the beginning, the first link of that, right? That's why he says craving is the basis of suffering. So he is actually talking in an actionable thing. He's not saying, okay, I know the solution. It's ignorance that is the problem. If you can fix it, then you'll be sorted. Because he wants to give a path for you to be able to walk down. And he says, okay, let's look at what action can you take. And let's points out craving. Craving is the basis of suffering. And he points out craving because that is something we can work with. That is something we can experience, right? So the tension and tightness, we start experiencing it. And as our mindfulness grows, as we go deeper into the meditation, right, we start seeing the different links, right? We see actually a gradation that is happening. Again, I'll talk about that, but that was a great insight, and that is the area that we work on, and we want to work right at the beginning. So once we go further, right? So normally, if you when you begin your practice, you are right in the middle of a thought pattern, and then you realize, okay, I've probably spent a couple of minutes thinking about something else. Now I need to go back, right? And that is something that is happening after multiple chains of dependent origination. There's a lot of thought process that is happening. So you first a thought came up, you thought something about it, you took a mental action. That set off another chain of dependent origination. Then you thought about it further. Okay, then what? So what? And then more thought happened, and you eventually caught yourself at some point, and you started coming back. But what if you could change the course of things at the first instance of craving? So that is what the practice starts to teach us to do. Any other thoughts or questions?
I, so I actually wanted to just I needed a little more sort of maybe a little more guidance on two aspects. One is that the way that I'm trying to understand this is ignorance, personalized conditioning, and consciousness is basically how we fundamentally filter reality. Uh,
So we have, so this is not the reality filtering part, right? It all is influence. So what is happening is, okay, why don't you finish your question? You might have a couple of more things that you're talking about, and I'll respond after that.
Okay, so maybe the way that I was the way that I had processed it is that there's like current foundation, which is the things that are happening around me. How am I sort of like filtering it, receiving it, perceiving it? Then there are some sort of like, let's say there's an impetus, right? Like an external impetus, which is contact and a feeling. And then the compulsive behavior is how I'm sort of responding to it. And there are, how that builds up basically. So yeah, I was able to sort of understand the bottom three, but mentality, materiality, and sense basis, I couldn't sort of like make a grasp of. And secondly, also like, isn't feeling and sanskar sort of intertwined? Because if there's an impetus and if I don't have any impressions from those actions, then I'll probably not have any feelings, right, regarding that.
Absolutely. So I think good insight and good question. So every link, like I said, that is on top is a story that is dependent on every story below. Okay. So the way you're conditioned, right, will affect, for example, your feeling, right? So let me take an example of a person you dislike, right? The mere mention of their name makes your skin crawl. You get a unpleasant feeling, right? Just somebody talking about that. You have a ear contact, and you recognize this as you have an unpleasant feeling just hearing their name, right? And even before you've understood what is happening, start with that, and you start with I don't like it, right? And finally, maybe your action is to dismiss that person, or just roll your eyes, or feel irritated, revisit whatever irritated you about. Now all this is going to eventually, the action that you take is going to color your conditioning, and your conditioning is going to make sure that the feeling is the same. Now if your conditioning was different over time, for example, using the 6 hours, right? If you use the 6 hours every time the feeling came up, you diffuse the craving. Okay. And then the action that you took, the mental action, thought that you thought, or the thing that you said, so it was not dependent on craving. It was not driven by the fact that you don't like it, right? You saw whether there was something for you to add in that situation, you added it. If there was nothing for you to do, you just let it be, right? So you took that action, and what happens is your mind learns that, hey, we didn't get irritated when this person's name came, right? Your mind is learning. So it is a prediction engine, it is also learning engine, right? It is every time it makes a prediction, it sees what happens and it learns for the next time it's going to predict. Okay. So it is learning now that maybe I don't need to generate a painful feeling. Your conditioning is changing and that is changing the feeling. You might have had some event happen many years back which irritated you, and it doesn't irritate you. Over time, you stopped getting caught up in craving. But it happened in a way that you didn't understand. It just happened on its own. Maybe it took years. Maybe it could have taken a month. Maybe it could have taken a week. Maybe it could have taken one sitting. Don't know. But the idea is that the conditioning is coloring consciousness as well, right? It is coloring feeling as well. Your conditioning is coloring all of these things, right? So when you, for example, when you look at the optical illusion, right? We saw the optical illusion. So your conditioning is coloring even the way your eyes, your vision, right? Information processing abilities, processing that picture. It is reducing it. It is saying that, hey, this is I've identified boxes. I see alternating patterns. So it is connecting to the way it is going is it is connecting to that concept of a checkerboard, right, or a chessboard. So your conditioning is coloring your consciousness. It is coloring mentality, materiality. It is coloring sense basis, right, and it is affecting feeling as well. So feeling is dependent a lot on your conditioning. Does that help? And see, everything is, we also see that this is a chain of events. This is a causal chain of events that is starting off. And there is a dependence. So there is not, it doesn't mean that one thing will cause the next thing. But for the next thing to be there, these conditions are important. And these conditions being there, sustain it. If the conditions change, it will not be there anymore. So when you diffuse the craving, then the distraction that is dependent on that ceases to be,
And
right?
also,
So you're chopping it off at the legs.
and also there's opportunity to change the current foundation because your new action.
So that's a great point, Amaraj. So ignorance, not understanding how the mind works. I did not put the other part. Again, I wanted to unpack it more later, but one of the things about ignorance is taking things personally. So making it all about me, right? So when you don't make it all about me, you see what's happening in the world and you see if there is an appropriate action for you to take. That is called acting with wisdom, right? So when you take an action that is beneficial for you and beneficial for the other persons, right? So that is acting with wisdom. And then you are creating conditioning that is rooted in wisdom. So conditioning that is rooted in ignorance, always like me, I like it, I don't like it, I want this, I don't want this. My happiness is predicated on things happening in a certain way. So that conditioning, every time you work with wisdom, right, you're changing that conditioning. Part of your conditioning is now rooted in wisdom. And over time, you can make all of your conditioning rooted in wisdom. That will change your feeling, and you will stop then acting with craving, but you will be acting with wholesome intent, right? So craving makes you like it basically brings up your animalistic instinct, right? So when I like it and I don't like it means this is the most important thing. If I like it, I'll do anything to get it. If I don't like it, I'll do anything to get rid of it, right? So that kind of almost animalistic response, we have a way to get away from it. We have a way to actually act from a higher state of being, right? The Brahma Viharas. We can act out of loving kindness. We can act out of compassion. We can act out of joy. We can act out of equanimity. Can do what is appropriate, and that changes the conditioning, that changes the ignorance to wisdom. Then you have this entire building standing on a foundation of wisdom. So that is what we want to move towards.
The bottom line being that from I like it, we have to remove the I and we have to remove the like. Basically, it's just it.
Yes, just diffuse the craving in it, right? So, I mean, I is a useful concept, right? You understand if you throw a brick vertically up, it's not going to hurt someone, it's going to hurt you, right? So, it's a useful concept. But that I like it, that thought of I like it, right, makes you desperate. So, if you don't do your taxes, somebody else won't go to jail, right? You will. So it is a use. So going back to the first thing we said, right? All models are incorrect, but some are useful. So the wisdom lies in understanding where this concept is useful to use and where it is actually leading to taking things personally and creating suffering for ourselves and for others. Right? So the actions that you take when you take things personally typically will lead to suffering for yourself and for others. So let's look at an example of that, right? So this is called the danger in gratification that is discussed in that the Buddha taught in a lot of suttas, right? So let's assume in a situation you have I like it and I don't like it, okay? And what you like, you want something. Say you want to have it. Now, if it comes to you, you are tasked with a different thing. Now you want the world to be in that state. You want your mindset. I want to be in a state of having something. And now you want the world to stay in a state where you have that thing. But the world is continuously changing. The underlying conditions may be continuously changing. And that may no longer be the case. So either you get what you want, and then you're worried about, preserving not just you're having that thing, but that state of mind when you had that, right? The feeling of joy that you had. So what you actually want is the joy when you went from not having it to having it. You want to preserve that state. So either you don't have it, don't get it, and you get dissatisfied because of that, or you have it, then you cannot maintain that same state of joy that you had when you went from having not having it to have. You can't maintain that state, then you have dissatisfaction, or you get into protecting it, that I don't now want to go into a state where I don't have it. I'm afraid of going into a state where I don't have it, right? So an example of a job, for example, you want that job. Once you get that job, you're not that happy as when you got that job. And at some point, especially in this environment, you might be afraid of losing that job, right? So I like it is not a guarantee of happiness, and not getting that job will is an easy thing to understand, right? Not sort of dissatisfaction related with that. So coming from that, like an example from a chat today of a friend was sharing that they saw an old colleague get a job that they were trying for. So they'd been trying for a while for that job, and another colleague from a previous company where they worked together got that same job, right? So that was the let's trace the dependent origination, right? So the first thing that happened was contact. So LinkedIn gave an update, saw something, immediately your uh, painful feeling came up because you saw the name of the company. You saw it'll be a little mixed. I am simplifying this right now, but like these are multiple cycles that are going, right? So I will compress it like in a single cycle. But what's happening? You have a painful feeling that things stood out, right? The name of somebody you know, the name of the company you applied to, and the fact that they got that, right? So you're processing that information before you've understood what it really means. There is a unpleasant feeling here, like what's happening here. This doesn't feel just or fair, Then there is craving that I don't like it, right? And based on that, there is now story building. Story building and habitual patterns. So now story building will lead to multiple chains of dependent origination. But you can think like, so you can get into stories. So as long as your mind is sustained with craving on that thought, you may go into multiple things, right? So I tried so hard for it. This guy seems to be always lucky, always seems to get his way. I never get my way. I'm always unlucky when it comes to jobs. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I really, I'm really terrible at interviews. Maybe something displeasing about my personality. You continue with craving. You have multiple loops happening. Maybe I need to lose weight. Maybe I don't look fit enough. Maybe that's why the other person got that job. So you have these habitual stories, habitual patterns, all of them are getting triggered. And as long as craving is holding, sustaining this uh, rabbit hole, right? So you will continue to be there. I don't like it, right? And you are trying to make sense of it. You can't take any action. There is no action to be taken here. The only action maybe is to actually congratulate the other person, which my friend did. But the point is, no, it couldn't avoid going into those cycles, right? Instead, at the point of craving, when you feel that tension and tightness, you realize, okay, this is an information. There is literally nothing for me to do except for to either congratulate that person or not congratulate that person. It has nothing to do with my life. So you can diffuse the craving, you can perform that action, get on with whatever is important, or you can stay with that. I don't like how the world is configured right now. I want it to be different. I can't do anything about it. So let me keep going. So the mind is looking for ways like what can I change about the world that can make this better, but it's coming at a dead end. So it is passing judgments. It is saying, okay, there's something wrong with me. It is questioning self-worth. So the hindrance of doubt becomes very strong. The hindrance of restlessness becomes very strong. The hindrance of aversion becomes strong. The hindrance of greed becomes strong, that I want something better than this person. So all these hindrances become compounded, right? So that's one example. Another example is so if there are two roommates, for instance, one of whom is untidy, and we gave an example of two rooms, one that was tidy and one that's untidy. So untidy person left a sock out, right? So the other person comes, there is a contact of eye contact, seeing the sock there. There is a painful feeling because so somebody who's untidy will not get a painful feeling when they see an untidy room. A person who is tidy will get a painful feeling because of their conditioning, right? They see that, immediately the mind goes into, I don't like it. And then with multiple cycles, you can, if you have something important to do, you will go ahead and do it. That'll be the end of it. You'll just say, you will be unhappy with your roommate and go away. But if you have more time, then you can get into multiple stories about, is the other person considerate, not considerate? Are you taking on a disproportionate amount of responsibilities? Or, you make sure the place is okay for their guests. Why can't the other person reciprocate? And then you can go back to like, okay, all North Indians or South Indians are like this, or all people of this community are like this. You can go into multiple stories, all of which is achieving no action, but creating suffering for you and wasting a lot of precious, limited time that you have in life, right? Instead, at the time of craving, you can use the 6R and you can decide either to leave it there, tell the person to pick it up when they come, or to pick it up and make sure to tell them to be careful about it and not to do it again, or something, work with that. Would take some action that is possible. Fermenting this in your mind is not useful, and that changes your conditioning, right? Over time, you understand that this is what it is, less about I like it and I don't like it. Okay, so I'll just stop sharing. I will share this image on the WhatsApp group. So that's what I wanted to cover today. Dependent origination. This is the core teaching. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. So this is an intellectual discussion. Might make sense, especially if you look at it a couple of times. But what is really important, right? I mentioned this right from the beginning. What the most important learning is something that will happen in your own practice, right? As you go deeper and deeper, as you go through the jhanas, right? Especially once you start going into the arupa jhanas, you start seeing the different links of dependent origination. Like I said, normally when you start off, especially your mind is, okay, we are in the middle of a story, 6R and come back. Middle of a story, 6R and come back. So already in clinging, habitual tendencies, action, you're in that part of the loop. You're actually making a lot of actions. You've done a lot of loops and you're there. As you start going deeper and deeper, you start seeing what happened before that. And this is a question you need to ask every time you catch your mind, right? So we talked about an awakening factor of investigation, of curiosity, right? So every time you catch your mind, You have to ask the question, what happened before that? So your attention doesn't go from point A to point B. It doesn't just appear here. It is here. Signals start coming. Vedana happens. It says, hello, I need attention. Something is up here, right? Your mind starts to wobble. It starts to move towards what's happening there. Then it decides like it or don't like it, personalize, invest in it, starts making stories, starts figuring out what to do there. So that is the entire process. And we normally catch it in the middle of the process. We need to ask ourselves what happened before? What happened before? So you will start slowly getting familiar with the clinging that is happening, then with the craving, the tightness right as it appears. You'll also start seeing the feeling. So the sixth dhyana, the base of infinite consciousness, you start seeing contact. So consciousness comes up, like I said, information, sense space, and consciousness coming together is contact. You start seeing consciousness happen. So if you hear a sound, so for example, if you hear somebody sweeping the floor, normally you hear a bunch of sounds and you model it. That is one sweep stroke, right? But what might be happening is actually every single stick in that broom is brushing by the ground, and it is brushing multiple times. The ground is a little uneven. When you start going into the base of infinite consciousness, you start seeing all those in extreme granularity, right? So you start hearing all of those. So you start coming towards contact. And as you start seeing this, you start understanding the process. This experiential learning is the only thing that really matters. Like being able to, and if you look at the quote, right, one who sees dependent origination, sees the Dhamma. Seeing dependent origination is the important part. So this is where you learn, and this is where you see what's happening. Yep, that's it from me. Any questions, any thoughts? We can take a couple and then we can end the session for today. Okay, let us share some merit. And I would recommend that you sit after the talk today. There is all of this will, again, it's a lot about different things starting to make space in your mind, different threads of the understanding starting to come in your mind, and then starting to actually create a new understanding of experience. Let's share some merit and repeat after me. May suffering once be suffering free, and the fear struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May enlightened beings of mighty power share in this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you.
Thank you.